Grace stood in Daniel's luxury apartment in Lekki, her hands trembling as she looked into the eyes of the man she had sacrificed everything for, and the words that came out of his mouth felt like knives stabbing into her chest one after another. "We're not in the same class anymore, Grace," Daniel said, his voice cold and emotionless like he was reading from a script. "You're a nobody, just an illiterate with a small shop, and I need someone who can match my new lifestyle." Tears streamed down her face as she begged him to remember all the nights she stayed awake making sure he had food to eat, all the times she paid his school fees when his family couldn't afford them, all the promises he made about loving her forever. But he just shook his head and told her it was over, that she had no place in his life anymore, and in that moment, Grace realized that the man she loved had become a stranger who saw her as nothing more than an embarrassment. How did it come to this? How did a love story built on sacrifice and devotion turn into a nightmare of rejection and betrayal? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning, back to when Grace was just a girl with a secret that could change everything. Her name was Grace, and she carried a burden that would have crushed most people her age, but she wore it quietly like an invisible crown that nobody could see. When her parents died in that terrible motor accident on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, she was only 15 years old and suddenly thrust into a world of boardrooms and business decisions that most adults would find overwhelming. She was their only child, so everything they had built over the years became hers, including the thriving logistics company that employed over 200 people across Lagos and Abuja. The grief nearly destroyed her in those early days, and there were nights when she would cry herself to sleep in their empty house wondering why life had been so cruel to take them away from her so soon. But Grace was her father's daughter, and he had raised her to be strong even when everything inside her wanted to break. She channeled all that pain and loss into growing the business, because it was the only connection she had left to the parents who would never see her graduate or get married or have children. By the time she turned 22, the company had expanded so much that she needed to hire a general manager to handle the daily operations while she made the major decisions from behind the scenes. Most of her employees had no idea what she looked like, because she preferred it that way, and the general manager became the face of the company while she remained invisible. She dressed simply when she went out, lived in a modest apartment in Yaba instead of the luxury penthouses she could easily afford, and made sure nobody could tell she was worth millions of naira. She did all of this because she had learned a painful lesson early in life, that people treated you differently when they knew you had money, and she wanted to meet someone who would love her for her heart and not her bank account. Grace had watched too many of her wealthy friends get into relationships with people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at them, and she promised herself she would never let that happen to her. She wanted real love, the kind her parents had, the kind that survived struggles and celebrated victories together, and she was willing to hide her wealth to find it. That's when she met Daniel at a friend's birthday party in Lekki, and everything changed in ways she never expected. He was a final-year student at the University of Lagos studying business administration, and there was something about his smile that made her feel safe and his ambition that made her believe in possibilities. He came from a struggling family in Surulere, where his father was a retired civil servant and his mother sold foodstuff at the local market. So money was always tight and life was always hard. But Daniel had dreams that reached higher than his circumstances, and he talked about those dreams with such passion that Grace found herself falling deeper and deeper into something she couldn't control. They started dating, and Grace watched as Daniel struggled with things that should have been basic necessities for a university student. She saw him skip meals because he couldn't afford to eat more than once a day, saw him wear the same 2 shirts over and over because he had nothing else, saw the stress in his eyes every time a new semester approached and school fees were due. It broke her heart to watch him suffer when she had more than enough money to solve all his problems with a single bank transfer. So she made a decision that would change both their lives in ways she couldn't predict at the time. Grace started paying Daniel's school fees without him knowing the real source of the money, and she bought his textbooks and made sure he had food to eat and clothes to wear that made him look like he belonged among his more privileged classmates. Every time he asked where she got the money from, she would smile and tell him about her small shop in Ikja where she sold fabrics and managed to make just enough to get by. She even took him to see the shop one day, a tiny space she had rented specifically to maintain the lie, and he believed every word because why wouldn't he trust the woman he loved? Daniel had no idea that the woman who claimed to be struggling alongside him was actually the owner of one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in Lagos. He had no idea that while he worried about next semester's fees, she was in virtual meetings approving contracts worth millions of naira and making business decisions that affected hundreds of employees. He had no idea that the simple girl who wore second-hand clothes and complained about transport fare was the same person who could buy him anything he wanted with a single phone call. Grace kept all of this hidden because she was terrified that if he knew the truth, everything would change, and the love she thought was real might turn out to be nothing more than opportunism disguised as affection. Things moved smoothly between them as the months turned into a year, and then 2 years of what Grace believed was genuine love. Daniel took her to meet his parents in their small apartment in Cerula, and even though his mother looked at her simple clothes with slight disappointment, clearly hoping her son would bring home someone more impressive, they accepted her because their son seemed happy. Grace sat in their cramped living room with peeling paint on the walls and ate rice and stew from chipped plates, and she smiled through it all because this was what love looked like to her, simple and real and honest. Daniel kept making promises about their future together, telling her that once he graduated and got a good job, they would get married and build a life that would make all her sacrifices worth it. He would hold her hand and look into her eyes with what seemed like genuine emotion and say things like, "You're the only one for me, Grace. I promise I'll take care of you for the rest of my life, and we'll build something beautiful together." She believed him with every fiber of her being because she had no reason not to, and she would lie awake at night imagining their wedding day and the children they would have and the life they would build together. In her mind, their love story was just beginning, and the best chapters were still waiting to be written. Hey my people, if you're feeling this story so far, do me a favor and drop a like on this video because it really helps the channel grow and lets me know you're enjoying these stories. Comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I love connecting with you all and hearing your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button to join this storytelling family because trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next in Grace's journey. Now let's get back to Grace, because her world was about to shift in ways she never saw coming, and the pain was only just beginning. The graduation day finally arrived, and Grace stood in the crowd at the University of Lagos convocation ground, wearing her simple dress and her wide smile as she watched Daniel receive his certificate. She felt proud of what they had achieved together, even though he had no idea just how much she had truly done for him, and how many strings she had pulled to make sure he could focus on his studies without financial stress. Daniel threw his cap in the air with all the other graduates, and in that moment, Grace believed that all her sacrifices were finally paying off and that their real life together was about to begin. She imagined a wedding within the year, children in a few years after that, and a lifetime of happiness built on the foundation of what she thought was genuine love. But reality had different plans, and those plans started unfolding when Daniel couldn't find a job no matter how hard he tried. He applied to banks and oil companies and multinational corporations across Lagos and Abuja, sending out his curriculum vitae every single day, and getting rejection after rejection that slowly started to chip away at his confidence. Grace watched him grow frustrated and bitter with each passing week, watched the light in his eyes start to dim as he began to believe he wasn't good enough for the corporate world, and she knew she had to do something before he completely gave up on himself and all his dreams. So Grace made a phone call that would set everything in motion, a phone call to her general manager with very specific instructions that had to be followed exactly. "I need you to create a branch manager position," Grace said over the phone from her bedroom, keeping her voice low even though Daniel wasn't there and couldn't possibly overhear. "I have someone I want to give the role to, someone very special to me, but he can never know that I own the company or that I arranged this. Can you make that happen without raising any suspicions?" The general manager agreed without hesitation because Grace was his boss and he respected her judgment, and he had learned over the years not to question her decisions because they always worked out in the company's favor. Within days, the position was created with a salary package that would make anyone's jaw drop, complete with a company car and a fully furnished 3-bedroom apartment in one of the best parts of Lekki. Grace then went to Daniel and casually mentioned that she had heard about this amazing job opening through a friend of a friend who worked in the industry, and maybe he should apply because his qualifications were perfect for it, and he shouldn't let this opportunity pass him by. At first Daniel refused, shaking his head and telling her that positions like that were for people with connections and family money and influential relatives, not for guys like him from struggling homes in Cerula where nobody had any power or influence. But Grace pushed and encouraged and reminded him of how brilliant he was and how much he had accomplished despite all the obstacles life had thrown at him. She spent hours building up his confidence until he finally agreed to try, and they sat down together at his small desk to write the application letter that would change everything between them in ways neither of them could have predicted. As they worked on the letter, something interesting happened that almost exposed Grace's secret and nearly ruined everything she had carefully planned. Daniel kept making mistakes in the structure and the wording, writing things that sounded too casual or too desperate. And Grace found herself correcting him over and over again because she had written dozens of business letters in her role as company owner. She knew exactly how to phrase things professionally, knew exactly what hiring managers wanted to see in an application. And she structured the letter with the expertise of someone who had been in the business world for years, making decisions that affected people's careers and livelihoods. Daniel noticed and looked at her with surprise in his eyes, and he asked her where she learned all this, since she was supposed to be just a small shop owner with basic education who had never worked in any corporate environment. For a moment, Grace's heart stopped because she thought the truth was about to come out and everything would be ruined. But she recovered quickly and told him she had been learning from the internet using her phone during her free time at the shop when customers weren't around. She said she watched YouTube videos about business writing and read articles about how to apply for professional jobs because she wanted to better herself and maybe help him when the time came. Daniel believed her because the lie was wrapped in just enough truth to sound believable, and they finished the letter and sent it off to the email address that Grace's general manager had provided. Then came the waiting game that nearly drove Daniel crazy with anticipation and anxiety. Day after day, he checked his email, hopping to see a response, refreshing his inbox every few hours and jumping every time his phone made a sound. Day after day, there was nothing but silence and more rejection emails from other companies he had applied to, companies that couldn't see his potential the way Grace could. By day 5, he had given up completely, telling Grace with defeat heavy in his voice that he knew it wouldn't work, because good things like that didn't happen to people like him who had no connections in high places. But Grace insisted he check one more time on day 7, and when he finally opened his email with reluctant fingers, expecting nothing, there it was sitting in his inbox like a golden ticket to a better life. He had gotten the job, and not just any job, but a branch manager position with a massive salary that was more than his father had made in his entire career as a civil servant. The package included a brand new car and a fully furnished 3-bedroom apartment in Lekki with a view of the city that took his breath away when he first saw it. Daniel screamed and jumped on Grace and called his parents immediately, and everyone celebrated like he had just won the lottery, while Grace celebrated right alongside him, even though she was the one who had orchestrated the entire thing from behind the scenes. She watched him shine with happiness and pride, saw the confidence return to his eyes and his smile, and in that moment she believed that everything was going to be perfect because the man she loved now had everything he needed to build their future together. Grace imagined them getting married within months, imagined standing beside him as his equal partner as he rose through the corporate world, imagined the children they would have and the life they would build together. She had no idea that her decision to give him this opportunity would be the beginning of the end of everything she held dear, and that the man she loved more than her own life would soon look at her with disgust instead of devotion. Was Grace's decision to hide her wealth and secretly give Daniel this job an act of pure love that deserved to be rewarded? Or was it a terrible mistake that would destroy everything she held dear and teach her the hardest lesson of her life? The answer would reveal itself soon enough, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again for Grace or Daniel or anyone connected to their story. Daniel's first day at the company started with so much promise and excitement that Grace could barely contain her joy as she watched him get ready in his new apartment. He stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie over and over again because he wanted everything to be perfect. And Grace sat on the edge of the bed smiling at him with so much love in her heart that it actually hurt. This was the moment she had been working towards for years, the moment when the man she loved would finally have the stability and success he deserved, and she had made it all happen without him ever knowing. He turned to her with nervous eyes and asked if he looked okay, and she walked over to him and fixed his collar and told him he looked like the branch manager he was about to become. The job transformed Daniel in ways that Grace hadn't fully anticipated, and at first those changes seemed wonderful and positive. He walked taller and spoke with more confidence, and when he came home from work each evening, he would tell Grace stories about the meetings he led, and the decisions he made, and the respect his team showed him. Grace loved seeing him like this because for so long he had struggled with feeling inadequate and unworthy, and now he was finally stepping into the man she always knew he could be. She would cook dinner in his fancy kitchen with its marble countertops and stainless steel appliances, and they would eat together while he talked about his day, and everything felt right in her world. His salary was more money than he had ever seen in his entire life, and suddenly Daniel could afford things that used to be impossible dreams. He bought new clothes from expensive stores in Victoria Island, traded in his old phone for the latest model, and started talking about investments and savings accounts like someone who had always had money. Grace watched all of this happen and felt nothing but pride because she believed she was watching her man grow into his full potential. His parents called every week asking how the job was going, and Daniel would spend hours on the phone telling them about his achievements while they praised him, and told him they always knew he would make something of himself. But then the cracks started appearing, small at first and easy to ignore. Daniel began coming home later than usual, claiming he had meetings that ran long or paperwork that needed finishing. Grace believed him because why wouldn't she? And she would wait up for him with dinner getting cold on the table while she scrolled through her phone managing her actual business that he still knew nothing about. When he finally arrived, he would be too tired to talk much, would eat quickly and fall asleep almost immediately. And Grace told herself this was just the pressure of a new demanding job and things would settle down eventually. Then came the weekend when everything shifted in a way that Grace couldn't ignore anymore. Daniel told her he was going out with some colleagues for a team-building dinner and wouldn't be able to spend Saturday evening with her like they usually did. Grace said that was fine, even though disappointment sat heavy in her chest, and she spent that Saturday night alone in her own apartment in Yarba wondering why she felt so uneasy. Something in Daniel's voice when he told her about the dinner had sounded off, like he was hiding something behind his words. But Grace pushed the feeling away and told herself she was being paranoid and insecure. What Grace didn't know was that there was a secretary at the company named Vanessa who had been watching Daniel from the moment he started working there. Vanessa was the kind of woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had no problem going after it. And what she wanted was Daniel with his new position and his company car and his impressive salary. She had been patient and calculating, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make her move. And she found that opportunity one Wednesday afternoon when she volunteered to deliver some urgent files to Daniel's apartment after office hours. Vanessa showed up at Daniel's door at 8 in the evening, wearing a tight red dress that left very little to the imagination. And when Daniel opened the door, his eyes went wide, because this was definitely not professional office attire. She smiled at him with red lipstick perfectly applied, and handed him the files while making sure to brush her fingers against his in a way that seemed accidental, but absolutely wasn't. She asked if she could come in for just a moment to explain some details about the documents, and Daniel hesitated for only a second before stepping aside and letting her enter his apartment. What happened that night changed everything between Daniel and Grace, though Grace wouldn't know about it for weeks. Vanessa made her intentions crystal clear within minutes of entering that apartment, and Daniel, who had never had a woman like her show interest in him before, made a choice that would destroy the best thing that ever happened to him. Grace was at home in Yarba that night working on quarterly reports for her company and thinking about Daniel with nothing but love and trust, while Daniel was in his Lecky apartment, betraying every promise he had ever made to her. After that night, Daniel started seeing Grace through completely different eyes, and those eyes were no longer filled with love and appreciation. Suddenly, her simple clothes looked shabby to him instead of humble, and her lack of formal education became something he was embarrassed about instead of something he had never cared about before. When she came to visit him at his apartment, he would make excuses about being busy or tired, and when she called he would let it ring until it went to voicemail. Grace felt the shift happening but couldn't understand what was causing it, and the confusion and hurt ate away at her day and night. Hey fam, before we continue with this heartbreaking turn of events, I need you to do something for me real quick. If this story is hitting you in your feelings right now, smash that like button because it helps more people discover these stories. Drop a comment and tell me what you think Daniel should do at this point, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already because this storytelling family is growing, and I want you to be part of it. Now let's get back to Grace, because what's about to happen will break your heart into pieces. Grace tried everything to fix whatever was breaking between them, even though she had no idea what she was trying to fix. She cooked his favorite meals and brought them to his apartment, but he barely touched the food and said he had already eaten. She suggested they go out like they used to, maybe catch a movie or take a walk on the beach, but he always had an excuse about work or exhaustion. She even offered to give him space if that's what he needed, thinking maybe the new job was overwhelming him and he just needed time to adjust. But the space only made things worse because it gave him more time with Vanessa. Finally, after 3 weeks of this torture, Grace confronted him directly because she couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. She showed up at his apartment on a Saturday morning unannounced, and when he opened the door he looked annoyed instead of happy to see her. She walked past him into the living room and turned to face him with tears already forming in her eyes, and she asked him straight out what was wrong and why he was treating her this way. Daniel stood there looking at her like she was a stranger, and then he said the words that shattered her entire world into a million pieces. "Grace, I think we need to end this," Daniel said, his voice cold and detached like he was talking to a business associate instead of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. "We're not in the same class anymore, you have to understand that. I'm a branch manager now, I have a certain image to maintain, and you're just not part of that image." Grace stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing because this couldn't be real. This couldn't be the same man who had promised to love her forever just months ago. She asked him what he meant by not being in the same class, and he actually laughed, a cruel, bitter sound that made her flinch. He told her she was a nobody, just a small shop owner with barely any education, and he needed someone sophisticated who could match his new lifestyle. He said these words looking directly into her eyes, without any trace of the love that used to live there. And Grace felt something inside her break in a way that might never be fixed. She begged him to reconsider, the words tumbling out of her mouth in desperate gasps between sobs. She reminded him of everything they had been through together, all the nights she stayed up helping him study for exams, all the times she made sure he had food when his parents couldn't send money, all the dreams they had built together about their future. She even offered to go back to school and get a proper education if that's what he wanted, told him she would enroll in part-time university classes immediately and work on becoming the sophisticated woman he claimed to need. But Daniel just shook his head and told her it was too late, that he had already moved on, and she needed to accept reality and move on too. Grace left his apartment that day feeling like someone had reached into her chest and ripped her heart out with bare hands. She drove back to her place in Yarba crying so hard she could barely see the road, and when she finally made it inside her apartment, she collapsed on the floor and cried until there were no more tears left in her body. For 3 days she barely ate or slept, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling trying to understand how the love of her life could throw her away like she meant nothing. She thought about revealing her true identity right then and there, about marching back to his apartment and telling him she owned the company and had given him everything he had. But something stopped her, because she realized that doing that would only prove his point that she wasn't good enough on her own merit. In her desperation and heartbreak, Grace decided to visit Daniel's parents because surely they would talk sense into their son and remind him about loyalty and gratitude. She took a bus to Cerullo on a Thursday afternoon and knocked on their door with hope still flickering weakly in her chest. Daniel's mother opened the door and looked surprised to see her, and Grace asked if they could talk about Daniel and what was happening between them. The parents invited her in, but the conversation that followed was even worse than the breakup itself. Grace explained everything to them, told them how Daniel had changed, and how he was treating her like trash after everything she had done for him. She expected them to be shocked and disappointed in their son, expected them to promise they would talk to him and make him see reason. But instead, Daniel's father looked at her with calculating eyes and asked her a question that made her blood run cold. "How much did you spend on him?" he asked, pulling out a small notebook and a pen like he was about to do accounting. "Calculate everything you think you spent on Daniel's education and upkeep, and we'll make sure he pays you back. Just name your price." Grace sat there frozen in disbelief, because they were treating her like a business investment, instead of someone who had loved their son with pure intentions. Daniel's mother nodded in agreement with her husband, and added that Grace should understand that their son was moving up in the world now, and needed someone who could move up with him. They actually thanked her for her help during the struggling years, but made it clear that she was no longer needed now that Daniel had made something of himself. Grace stood up and walked out of that house without saying another word, because there was nothing left to say to people who saw love as a transaction. But there was one person in that family who saw things differently, and his name was Marcus, Daniel's older brother. Marcus had been sitting quietly in the corner during that entire conversation, and after Grace left, he stood up and told his parents and Daniel, who had come over for dinner, that what they were doing was wrong and cruel. He said Grace deserved better than this treatment, that she had shown more character and integrity than any of them, and that they should be ashamed of themselves for supporting Daniel's betrayal. The family turned on Marcus immediately, calling him a fool and saying he was jealous of his younger brother's success. Daniel's father actually told Marcus that this was why he would never amount to anything in life, because he didn't understand how the world worked and couldn't recognize opportunities when they presented themselves. They treated Marcus like an enemy just for speaking the truth, but he didn't back down or apologize because he knew what was right and what was wrong. Marcus found Grace's number through an old family group chat and called her that same night to apologize for his family's behavior. Grace was surprised to hear from him because she barely knew Marcus, and had only met him a few times at family gatherings, where he always seemed quiet and thoughtful. He told her he was sorry for what Daniel and his parents had done, and he asked if he could take her out for coffee sometime just to check on her and make sure she was okay. Grace hesitated at first because the last thing she wanted was to be around anyone connected to Daniel. But something in Marcus's voice told her his intentions were genuine and kind. Would Marcus's kindness be the beginning of Grace's healing? Or was this just another chapter in a story that was destined to break her even further? The truth was waiting just around the corner, and it would change absolutely everything. Grace sat in the small coffee shop in Yarba staring at her cup of tea that had long gone cold, and she wondered if accepting Marcus's invitation was a mistake, because the last thing she needed was another connection to the family that had destroyed her heart. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late, looking apologetic and genuine in a way that reminded her of how Daniel used to be before success changed him into someone unrecognizable. He sat down across from her and immediately started apologizing for everything his family had done, and Grace could see in his eyes that he genuinely felt ashamed of how his brother and parents had treated her. She told him it wasn't his fault and he didn't need to apologize for other people's choices, but Marcus shook his head and said that staying silent when wrong was being done made him just as guilty as the people doing the wrong. They talked for hours that first day, and Grace found herself opening up to Marcus in ways she hadn't expected, because there was something safe about him that made her feel like she could be vulnerable without being judged. She told him about how she had supported Daniel through university, though she kept the full truth about her wealth hidden, because that secret was still hers to protect. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished he told her that Daniel was a fool who didn't deserve her, and that karma had a way of catching up with people who threw away genuine love for shallow appearances. Grace smiled weakly at his words, because in that moment, she desperately wanted to believe that justice would eventually find its way to Daniel, but her heart was still too broken to feel anything close to satisfaction or hope. Marcus started calling Grace regularly after that first coffee meeting, and at first, she thought he was just being kind because he felt guilty about his family's behavior. He would check on her every few days asking how she was doing, and if she needed anything, and sometimes he would send her funny videos or inspirational quotes just to make her smile. Grace appreciated the gestures more than she could express because most days she felt like she was drowning in sadness, and having someone throw her a lifeline made all the difference in the world. She started looking forward to his calls and messages because they reminded her that not everyone in the world was cruel and selfish like Daniel had become. After a few weeks of phone conversations, Marcus asked if he could take Grace out to dinner, and he made it clear that it wasn't a romantic gesture, but rather just one friend helping another friend through a difficult time. Grace hesitated because going out felt too much like moving on when her heart was still firmly attached to Daniel despite everything he had done to her. But Marcus insisted in his gentle way that staying home and crying wasn't going to heal her wounds, and maybe getting out and having a nice meal would help her remember that life still had good moments worth experiencing. She finally agreed, and they went to a modest restaurant in Ikja where the food was delicious and the atmosphere was warm and comfortable. That dinner was the first time Grace had laughed genuinely in weeks, and it surprised her how good it felt to just be herself without pretending or hiding or trying to be someone she wasn't. Marcus had a way of making her feel seen and valued, and he never once made her feel like she was less than anyone else because of her supposed lack of education or wealth. They talked about everything from childhood memories to dreams for the future, and Grace found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't been able to relax since Daniel broke her heart. When Marcus drove her home that night, she thanked him for giving her a few hours where she didn't feel like the world was ending, and he smiled and told her that was just the beginning of better days ahead. Meanwhile, Daniel was living what he thought was his best life in his luxury apartment in Lekki, and he had no idea that the foundation of everything he had was built on the love of the woman he had thrown away. He spent his evenings at expensive nightclubs in Victoria Island with Vanessa by his side, and she made sure everyone knew that Daniel was her man now. They would arrive in his company car and Daniel would order expensive bottles of champagne like money meant nothing, and Vanessa would laugh and dance and whisper things in his ear that made him feel like he was on top of the world. His colleagues from work would join them sometimes, and they all treated Daniel like he was someone important and successful, and that validation fed his ego in ways that made him forget where he came from and who had helped him get there. Vanessa was playing her own game though, and Daniel was too blind to see it because he thought she genuinely cared about him. She saw him as a stepping stone to something better, someone she could use to climb higher in the company and make connections that would benefit her career. She would go through his phone when he was in the shower checking his messages and emails, and she would ask subtle questions about his work and his responsibilities, trying to figure out who really held power in the company. Daniel thought she was just interested in his life, but Vanessa was gathering information and waiting for the right opportunity to make her next move up the corporate ladder. Back in Cerula, Daniel's parents were celebrating their son's success like it was their own achievement, and they had completely forgotten about Grace and everything she had done for their family. Daniel's mother would tell neighbors about her son, the branch manager, who lived in Lekki and drove a company car, and she would conveniently leave out the part about the girl who had paid for his education and supported him when they couldn't. Daniel's father had used some of the money Daniel gave him to renovate their small apartment, and he walked around the neighborhood with his chest puffed out like he had always known his son would make something of himself. The only person in that family who felt any guilt or shame was Marcus, and they treated him like an outcast because he refused to celebrate Daniel's success when it had been built on betrayal and ingratitude. Hey fam, I need to pause here for just a moment because this story is getting intense, and I want to make sure you're still with me. If you're feeling the emotions in this story, drop a like and let me know in the comments what you think is going to happen next. Do you think Daniel will realize his mistake, or is he too far gone? And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because we're building a community of people who love real stories about real situations. Now let's get back to Grace and Marcus, because something beautiful was starting to bloom in the midst of all this pain. Marcus continued to be there for Grace in ways that slowly started to heal the wounds Daniel had left on her heart. He took her to art galleries in Ikoyi, where they would walk around looking at paintings and sculptures, and Grace discovered she had a love for contemporary African art that she never knew existed. He took her to the beach on Saturday mornings when the crowds were small, and they could walk along the shore talking about life and dreams and second chances. He took her to bookstores where she would spend hours browsing through novels and business books, and Marcus never once made her feel rushed or impatient. Every moment they spent together felt natural and easy, like they had known each other for years instead of just a few months. Grace tried to keep her guard up because her heart was still bruised and tender from Daniel's betrayal, and she didn't want to make the same mistake of trusting someone who might eventually hurt her. But Marcus was patient in ways that Daniel had never been, and he never pushed her or demanded anything from her emotionally. He seemed content to just be her friend and support her through her healing journey, and that patience made Grace start to see him differently. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he always opened doors for her and made sure she was comfortable, the way he listened when she talked like her words actually mattered to him. One evening after they had dinner at a small restaurant in Cerula, Marcus drove Grace back to her apartment in Yaba, and they sat in his car talking for over an hour before she got out. The conversation had turned deeper than usual, and Marcus told her about his own struggles and disappointments in life, about how he had always felt overshadowed by his younger brother Daniel, who everyone seemed to favor despite Marcus being the firstborn. He told her about failed business ventures and broken relationships, and Grace realized that Marcus understood pain and rejection in ways that made him genuinely empathetic to what she was going through. When she finally said goodnight and walked toward her apartment building, she turned back to wave at him and felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. Grace started to realize that her feelings for Marcus were changing from friendship into something deeper and more meaningful, but she was terrified to acknowledge it, because what if she was wrong again? What if Marcus turned out to be just like his brother once he got what he wanted from her? What if this was all just a game and she was falling for another lie? These questions kept her awake at night, and she found herself analyzing every interaction they had, trying to find red flags or warning signs that she might have missed. But no matter how hard she looked, Marcus remained consistent and genuine and kind in ways that gradually broke down the walls she had built around her heart. Marcus seemed to sense that Grace was struggling with her feelings, and one Saturday afternoon at a quiet cafe in Lekki, he decided to address it directly, because he couldn't stand watching her torture herself with doubt anymore. He reached across the table and took her hand gently, and he told her that he understood she was scared because of what Daniel had done to her. He said he wasn't asking her to love him or trust him immediately, but he wanted her to know that his intentions were pure, and he would never treat her the way his brother had. He told her that he had watched her suffer from his brother's cruelty, and something inside him had broken seeing such a good person being treated so badly. And from that moment, he had wanted to show her that not all men were like Daniel. Grace felt tears well up in her eyes because nobody had ever been this honest and vulnerable with her before, and she squeezed Marcus's hand and told him she was trying to let her guard down, but it was harder than she expected. Marcus smiled and said they could take all the time she needed because he wasn't going anywhere, and that promise felt more real than any promise Daniel had ever made to her. In that moment, sitting in that cafe with Marcus holding her hand, Grace felt something shift inside her heart, like a door that had been locked tight was slowly starting to open again. The weeks turned into months, and Grace and Marcus's relationship continued to grow stronger and deeper with each passing day. They spent almost all their free time together, and Grace found herself laughing more and crying less, and slowly becoming the person she used to be before Daniel broke her. Marcus never asked her about the small shop she claimed to own, never questioned how she managed to always look put together despite supposedly struggling financially. And Grace appreciated that he seemed to love her for who she was rather than constantly trying to figure out what she had. She still hadn't told him the truth about her wealth and her company, but she was starting to think that maybe it was time to be honest, because Marcus had proven himself to be trustworthy in ways that made her believe he would accept her regardless of her financial status. One evening after they had been dating for about 6 months, Marcus took Grace to a nice restaurant overlooking the Lagos Lagoon and told her he had something important to ask her. Grace's heart started racing because she thought he was going to propose, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that level of commitment yet. But instead, Marcus told her that he loved her more than he had ever loved anyone in his life, and he wanted to know if she would be willing to meet his family officially as his girlfriend. Grace's first instinct was to say no, because the thought of facing Daniel and his parents again made her feel sick to her stomach. But Marcus promised her that he would be by her side the entire time, and he wouldn't let anyone disrespect her or make her feel uncomfortable. Grace thought about it for several days before finally agreeing, because she realized that hiding from Daniel and his family gave them power over her life, and she was tired of feeling like a victim. She told Marcus she would go to the family dinner he was planning, but she made him promise that if things got uncomfortable, they would leave immediately. Marcus agreed and promised to protect her no matter what happened, and Grace believed him because he had never given her any reason to doubt his word. What neither of them knew was that this family dinner would be the beginning of a chain of events that would expose secrets and shift power in ways that nobody could have predicted. The dinner was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at Marcus and Daniel's parents' house in Surulere, and Grace spent the entire week leading up to it feeling anxious and nervous about seeing Daniel again. She kept asking herself why she had agreed to this when she could have just continued avoiding the family and living her life peacefully with Marcus. But a small part of her wanted Daniel to see that she had moved on, wanted him to see that his rejection hadn't destroyed her completely, and wanted him to know that his brother saw value in her, even if he didn't. Grace chose a simple but elegant dress for the dinner, nothing too fancy but nice enough to show that she had dignity and self-respect. And when Marcus picked her up that Sunday, he told her she looked beautiful and everything would be fine. They arrived at the house in Surulere, and Grace felt her stomach twist with anxiety as they walked toward the door, but Marcus held her hand tightly and whispered that he was right there with her. Daniel's mother opened the door and her face showed clear shock at seeing Grace standing there with Marcus, and for a moment nobody said anything as the awkwardness hung thick in the air. Then Marcus spoke up firmly and told his mother that Grace was his girlfriend now, and she was there as his guest, and his mother had no choice but to step aside and let them in. As they entered the living room, Grace saw Daniel sitting on the couch with Vanessa beside him, and the look on Daniel's face when he saw Grace with his brother was absolutely priceless. Was this family dinner going to be the moment when everything came crashing down? Or was it just the calm before an even bigger storm that nobody saw coming? The answer would unfold over the next few hours, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them again. The silence in that living room was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and Grace stood there beside Marcus, feeling every pair of eyes in the room boring into her like lasers, trying to figure out what she was doing there with the brother of the man who had rejected her. Daniel's jaw had practically dropped to the floor when he saw her walk in holding Marcus's hand, and Vanessa beside him looked confused and slightly threatened, like she sensed competition, even though she had no idea who Grace really was. Daniel's mother finally found her voice and asked Marcus what was going on, and why he had brought this girl back into their home. And the way she said "this girl" with such disdain made Grace's blood boil, even though she kept her face calm and composed. Marcus squared his shoulders and looked his mother directly in the eyes, and he told her in a firm voice that Grace was his girlfriend now, and she deserved the same respect any other guest would receive in their home. He said that if anyone had a problem with Grace being there, they could take it up with him, but they would not disrespect her or make her feel unwelcome because she had done nothing wrong. Daniel's father, who had been sitting quietly in his chair reading a newspaper, finally looked up and told Marcus that he was making a fool of himself by getting involved with his brother's leftovers. And those words hit Grace like a physical blow, even though she had prepared herself for cruelty. But before Grace could respond or before Marcus could defend her, something unexpected happened that shifted the entire energy in the room. Daniel stood up from the couch with anger flashing in his eyes, and he told Marcus that he needed to have some self-respect and stop picking up garbage that he had thrown away. He said Grace was nothing but a poor, uneducated girl who had been lucky enough to be with him for a while, and now Marcus was degrading himself and their family name by associating with her. Vanessa laughed beside Daniel like his words were the funniest thing she had ever heard, and that laugh made Grace realize just how much Daniel had poisoned everyone around him with his toxic attitude and false sense of superiority. Marcus took a step toward Daniel with his fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment Grace thought there might be a physical confrontation right there in the living room. But Marcus took a deep breath and unclenched his fists, because he was not the kind of man who solved problems with violence or aggression. Instead, he told Daniel that the only garbage in this room was his character and his complete lack of gratitude for the woman who had sacrificed everything to help him succeed. He reminded Daniel that when he was struggling to pay school fees and couldn't afford to eat properly, Grace was the one who made sure he survived, and now Daniel had the audacity to call her garbage after everything she had done. Daniel laughed mockingly and said that whatever Grace did was her choice, and he never asked her to do any of it, so she shouldn't expect him to be grateful for something he never requested. He said that if Grace was stupid enough to spend her money on a man without any guarantee of return, then that was her problem and not his responsibility. Grace felt something inside her snap at those words, because she realized that Daniel had not just stopped loving her. He had become someone completely devoid of basic human decency and empathy. She opened her mouth to finally tell him the truth about who she really was and how she had orchestrated his entire career, but Marcus squeezed her hand gently and shook his head slightly, as if asking her to wait. Daniel's mother tried to calm the situation down by suggesting they all sit down and have dinner like civilized people, but the damage had already been done, and the atmosphere was poisoned beyond repair. Grace told Marcus quietly that she wanted to leave because she couldn't sit at the same table with people who had so little respect for her, and Marcus nodded and told his family that they would be going. As they turned to walk toward the door, Daniel called out behind them and said that Marcus should enjoy his charity case while it lasted, and that comment made Grace stop in her tracks and turn around slowly. She looked at Daniel standing there with his expensive clothes and his arrogant smirk, and she felt a calmness wash over her that surprised even herself, because instead of feeling hurt or angry, she just felt pity for how small and pathetic he had become. She told him in a clear, steady voice that he should enjoy his current lifestyle while it lasted, because karma had a way of balancing the scales eventually, and people who built their success on the backs of others without gratitude always fell harder than they rose. Daniel laughed and told her to stop speaking in riddles and just accept that she was beneath him now, and Grace smiled mysteriously and said that time would reveal who was really beneath whom. Marcus and Grace left the house and drove in silence for several minutes before Marcus finally asked if she was okay. And Grace told him she was better than okay, because she had finally seen Daniel for who he truly was without any illusions or false hope clouding her judgment. She said that being in that house and hearing those cruel words had actually freed her from the last chains of affection she had been holding onto. And now, she could move forward with Marcus without any emotional baggage from her past. Marcus pulled the car over to the side of the road and turned to look at Grace, and he told her that he loved her more than anything in this world, and he wanted to marry her if she would have him. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes because this was so different from how Daniel had made promises, because Marcus was asking her to be his wife after seeing her at her most vulnerable and broken, not because of what she could do for him, but because of who she was as a person. She said yes without hesitation, and they sat in that car on the side of the road crying and laughing and holding each other while cars passed by honking at them. Marcus told her they would get married as soon as possible because he didn't want to waste any more time. And Grace agreed because she had learned that life was too short to wait for perfect moments that might never come. Hey my people, can we just take a moment to appreciate Marcus for being a real one? This is what genuine love looks like, and I need you to drop a comment telling me if you believe Grace and Marcus are meant to be together. Smash that like button if you're rooting for them, and subscribe to this channel, because the next episode is going to blow your mind with revelations that will change everything. Now let's get back to the story, because Grace was about to make a decision that would shake Daniel's entire world to its foundation. The wedding planning happened quickly, because both Grace and Marcus wanted a simple ceremony without too much fuss or drama, and they decided to get married within 2 months at a small registry in Lagos, with just a few close friends as witnesses. Grace still hadn't told Marcus the full truth about her wealth and her company, and she wrestled with whether she should reveal everything before the wedding or wait until after. She finally decided that Marcus deserved to know who he was really marrying. So one evening she invited him to her apartment in Yarba and told him to sit down because she had something important to share. Marcus looked nervous, like he thought she was about to tell him she had changed her mind about the wedding. But Grace smiled and took his hand and told him that what she was about to reveal would not change anything between them, but it would definitely surprise him. She started from the beginning, telling him about her parents' death and the inheritance and the company that had grown into something much bigger than anyone expected. She told him about the general manager who ran things while she made decisions from behind the scenes. And she told him about how she had orchestrated Daniel's job to help him succeed because she had loved him so much. Marcus sat there in stunned silence as Grace spoke, and she could see his mind working to process everything she was telling him because this was so different from the story he thought he knew. When she finished talking, there was a long pause, and Grace held her breath waiting for his reaction because she had no idea how he would handle this revelation. Then Marcus started laughing, not mockingly but with genuine amusement and disbelief, and he told her that she was the most incredible woman he had ever met, and this just made him love her even more. He asked her why she had hidden all of this for so long, and Grace explained that she had been hurt too many times by people who only saw her money and not her heart, and she needed to be sure that Marcus loved her for the right reasons. Marcus told her he understood completely, and he was honored that she trusted him enough to share her truth. And then he asked her a question that made her heart swell with love. He asked if she would let him work alongside her in the company after they got married, not as someone looking for a handout, but as a genuine partner who wanted to help her build something even greater. Grace agreed immediately because she could see that Marcus's intentions were pure, and he genuinely wanted to be part of her life in every way possible, not just romantically but also professionally. They spent the rest of that evening planning their future together, talking about how they would run the company and where they would live and what kind of life they wanted to build. Grace felt happier than she had felt in years because she finally had a partner who saw her as an equal and wanted to build with her rather than taking from her. The wedding day arrived on a beautiful Saturday morning in Lagos, and Grace wore a simple white dress that made her look elegant and radiant without being over the top. Marcus wore a tailored suit and couldn't stop smiling as they stood before the registry official and exchanged their vows. A few of Grace's business associates attended along with some of Marcus's friends, but notably absent were Marcus's parents and Daniel, because Marcus had made it clear that they were not welcome at his wedding after how they had treated Grace. When the official pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed Grace with such tenderness and love that everyone in the room could feel the genuine emotion between them. After the wedding, Grace and Marcus went on a short honeymoon to a resort in Calabar, where they spent a week relaxing and enjoying each other's company without any stress or drama from the outside world. It was during this honeymoon that Grace told Marcus about her plan to reveal her identity to the company, and specifically to Daniel. And Marcus initially tried to talk her out of it because he thought it might cause unnecessary drama. But Grace explained that she needed to do this not for revenge, but for closure. And she needed Daniel to understand the magnitude of what he had thrown away and the depth of his own ignorance and arrogance. Marcus finally agreed, but made Grace promise that she wouldn't let Daniel's reaction affect her emotional well-being. And Grace promised, because she had already moved past Daniel emotionally. And this revelation was more about setting the record straight than about hurting him. They returned to Lagos after the honeymoon, and Grace immediately set plans in motion for the company meeting that would change everything. She contacted her general manager and told him to schedule an all-staff meeting for the following Monday. And she gave him specific instructions about who needed to be present, including all branch managers, which meant Daniel would be there. The general manager was surprised because Grace had never attended a company-wide meeting before, always preferring to stay in the shadows and let him be the face of the organization. But he followed her instructions without question because he understood that something significant was about to happen. Grace spent the weekend preparing herself mentally and emotionally for the confrontation, and Marcus stayed by her side offering support and encouragement whenever she needed it. She picked out a powerful business suit that screamed authority and success, and when she looked at herself in the mirror on Monday morning, she barely recognized the confident woman staring back at her. The company headquarters in Victoria Island was buzzing with activity that Monday morning as employees filtered in for the mysterious all-staff meeting that had been called with very little explanation. Daniel arrived in his company car feeling annoyed because he had other plans for the day, and this meeting was disrupting his schedule. He sat in the large conference room with the other branch managers and department heads, and he complained to the person next to him about how these meetings were always a waste of time and never accomplished anything useful. Vanessa, who worked in the same building, had managed to sneak into the meeting even though she wasn't technically required to be there, and she sat in the back row hoping to gain some useful information she could use to advance her career. The general manager stood at the front of the room and called the meeting to order, and he announced that they had a very special guest who would be addressing them today. He said that this person was the real owner and founder of the company, and her presence here today marked a historic moment in the organization's history. Confusion rippled through the room, because most employees, including Daniel, had always assumed that the general manager was the owner, or at least reported directly to some shadowy board of directors that nobody ever saw. Then the doors at the back of the conference room opened, and Grace walked in wearing her power suit and carrying herself with a confidence that commanded immediate attention and respect. Could this be the moment when Daniel finally understood who Grace really was? Or would his arrogance blind him even to the truth that was standing right in front of him? The next few minutes would determine everything, and the revelation would leave everyone in that room absolutely speechless. Every single person in that conference room turned to look at the woman walking through those doors, and the air itself seemed to freeze as recognition slowly dawned on different faces at different speeds, like dominoes falling in slow motion. Grace moved with a grace and authority that made it impossible to look away, and her heels clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to something explosive and irreversible. She walked past rows of employees who whispered to each other trying to figure out who this powerful woman was, and she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at Daniel, even though she could feel his confused stare burning into the side of her face. Daniel sat there completely frozen in his chair with his mouth slightly open, and his brain was working overtime trying to make sense of what his eyes were showing him, because this couldn't be the same Grace who he had called an illiterate and a nobody just months ago. This woman looked like she owned the world, and the way everyone in the room suddenly sat up straighter and paid attention told him that she was someone important. But his mind refused to connect the dots, because accepting the truth would mean accepting that he had made the biggest mistake of his entire life. Vanessa leaned forward in her seat at the back, trying to get a better look, and she felt a twist of jealousy in her stomach, because whoever this woman was, she clearly had the kind of power and presence that Vanessa had been desperately trying to cultivate for years. Grace reached the front of the conference room and stood beside the general manager, and she turned to face the crowd with her chin held high and her shoulders back like a queen addressing her subjects. The general manager cleared his throat and spoke into the microphone, and his voice echoed through the room as he made the announcement that would change everything. He said that he wanted to officially introduce everyone to Grace Okonkwo, the owner and CEO of the company, the woman who had built this empire from the ground up after inheriting it from her late parents and growing it into one of the most successful logistics companies in Nigeria. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps, and people turned to each other with wide eyes trying to process this information that seemed impossible and yet was clearly true. Daniel felt like someone had punched him in the stomach and knocked all the air out of his lungs, and he gripped the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles turned white, because this couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of sick joke or nightmare that he would wake up from any second, because there was no way the girl he had dismissed as poor and uneducated was actually the owner of the company that employed him and gave him everything he had. Grace picked up the microphone and thanked the general manager, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, and filled with a quiet strength that made everyone in the room lean forward to hear what she would say next. She told them that she had always preferred to work behind the scenes, because she believed that true leadership wasn't about being seen, but about making sure everyone else could succeed. And the general manager had done an excellent job representing her vision for the company over the years. She said that today she was stepping out of the shadows because it was time for everyone to know the truth about who really ran things, and it was time for some people in this room to understand the consequences of their actions and choices. As Grace spoke, Daniel's world was crumbling around him piece by piece like a building being demolished in slow motion, and every word that came out of her mouth was another hammer blow to his pride and his ego. He thought back to all the times she had paid his school fees and bought his textbooks and made sure he had food, and he realized now that she hadn't been struggling or sacrificing her last money like he thought. She had been a millionaire playing the role of a poor girl because she wanted to be loved for who she was and not for what she had. And he had failed that test spectacularly by proving that he was exactly the kind of shallow person she had been trying to avoid. Grace's eyes finally found Daniel sitting there looking like he had seen a ghost, and she held his gaze for a long moment that felt like an eternity to him, because he could see everything in her eyes. He could see the disappointment and the hurt and the pity, and that pity was worse than any anger could have been, because it meant she no longer saw him as someone worth her emotional energy. She continued speaking to the room, and she told them about how she believed in giving people opportunities to prove themselves and grow. But she also believed in accountability and making sure that people understood the weight of their choices. Then Grace made an announcement that sent another shockwave through the room, and she said that effective immediately, there would be some organizational changes in the company structure. She explained that her husband Marcus would be joining the company as the new chief operations officer, and he would be overseeing all branch operations and working directly with her to expand the business into new territories across West Africa. The employees applauded politely because they understood that this was a significant appointment. But Daniel felt like the floor was dropping out from under him because he suddenly realized that Marcus would now be his direct supervisor and would have authority over everything he did. But Grace wasn't finished yet, and what came next was the final blow that would destroy everything Daniel had built his false confidence on. She said that the branch manager position that Daniel currently held would be reassigned to Marcus, and Daniel would be offered a different role in the company at a lower level if he chose to accept it. She explained that this decision wasn't made out of spite or revenge, but rather out of a desire to put the right people in positions of leadership. And she believed that Marcus had demonstrated the kind of character and integrity that was needed to lead teams and represent the company's values. Daniel stood up abruptly, and his chair scraped loudly against the floor, and everyone in the room turned to look at him as his face turned red with humiliation and anger. He asked Grace in a voice shaking with emotion how she could do this to him after everything they had been through together, and the irony of his question was completely lost on him because he couldn't see past his own wounded pride. Grace looked at him with those calm, steady eyes and reminded him that he was the one who had thrown her away and called her garbage, and he was the one who had told her she was beneath him and had no place in his new life. She said that she had given him this job in the first place because she loved him and wanted to see him succeed, and she had watched from the shadows as he took everything she gave him and used it to become someone cruel and ungrateful. She told him that this wasn't about revenge, because she had already moved past him emotionally and mentally, but it was about making sure the company was run by people who understood the value of loyalty and gratitude and treating others with respect. Daniel opened his mouth to argue or defend himself, but no words came out because deep down he knew that everything she was saying was true, and there was nothing he could say that would change the reality of what he had done. Hey fam, I need you to pause and really feel this moment with me, because this is what justice looks like when karma finally catches up with people who thought they could treat others badly without consequences. Drop a like if you think Grace handled this the right way, and comment below telling me what you would have done in her situation. Don't forget to subscribe, because you're part of this storytelling family now, and trust me when I say the story isn't over yet. Now let's get back to Daniel's world falling apart in front of everyone he works with. Vanessa, who had been watching from the back of the room, suddenly understood everything, and she felt her own stomach drop because she realized that the man she had attached herself to was about to lose everything. She had chosen Daniel because she thought he was successful and stable and could help her climb the corporate ladder. But now she saw that he had built his success on lies and the generosity of a woman he had foolishly rejected. Vanessa quietly stood up and slipped out of the conference room before anyone could notice, because she had no intention of going down with Daniel's sinking ship. And she was already mentally calculating which other manager in the company might be worth pursuing for her next strategic relationship. Daniel watched Vanessa leave and realized in that moment that everyone who he thought cared about him had only been there for what he could offer them. And now that his status was being stripped away, they were abandoning him without a second thought. He looked around the conference room at his colleagues who were all avoiding eye contact with him, and he understood that he had become a cautionary tale right before their eyes. The mighty branch manager who had acted like he was better than everyone else was being brought down by the very woman he had dismissed. And everyone in that room would remember this moment and talk about it for years to come. Grace dismissed the meeting and told everyone to return to their duties, and the employees filed out of the conference room in small groups, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. Daniel remained standing there like a statue because he didn't know where to go or what to do, and for the first time in months, he felt completely lost and powerless. Marcus entered the conference room from a side door where he had been watching everything unfold. and he walked up to stand beside Grace and put his arm around her waist in a gesture of support and solidarity. Daniel looked at his brother and his ex-girlfriend, standing there together as husband and wife, as CEO and COO of a multi-million naira company, and the full weight of what he had lost finally crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He had lost the love of a good woman who would have stood by him through anything. He had lost the respect of his own brother, who had tried to warn him about his destructive behavior. And he had lost the financial stability that he had foolishly thought was his own achievement, when in reality it had all been a gift from the woman he had called worthless. Grace walked over to Daniel and stood in front of him, and she spoke to him in a voice that was quiet enough that only he could hear what she was saying. She told him that she hoped he had learned something from all of this, and she hoped that in his next relationship, he would treat people with the kindness and respect they deserved instead of judging them based on superficial things like education or social status. She said that she forgave him for the pain he had caused her because holding onto anger would only poison her own happiness. But forgiveness didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences for his actions. Daniel felt tears stinging his eyes because he finally understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed, and he wanted to apologize and beg her to give him another chance, but he knew it was too late for that. Grace had moved on with his brother and had built a life that didn't include him, and there was nothing he could do to turn back time and make different choices. He nodded silently, because words felt inadequate in the face of everything that had happened, and Grace gave him a small sad smile before turning and walking out of the conference room with Marcus by her side. Daniel was left standing alone in that empty conference room, and he slowly sank back into his chair as the reality of his new situation settled over him like a heavy blanket. He would have to give up the luxury apartment in Lekki and the company car and the impressive salary, and he would have to return to something much smaller and more humble if he even chose to stay with the company at all. His parents, who had been so proud of his success, would be devastated when they learned what had happened, and they would probably blame him for embarrassing the family and throwing away such a good opportunity. But worse than any of that was the knowledge that he had become exactly the kind of person he used to despise. Someone who valued material things more than genuine human connections, and who treated people as disposable when they no longer served a purpose. Daniel sat there in the silence and tried to figure out how he had gotten to this point, and he realized that every choice he had made after getting that job had been driven by ego and insecurity, rather than by the values his parents had tried to teach him growing up. He had let success go to his head, and he had forgotten where he came from, and now he was paying the price for that arrogance in the most public and humiliating way possible. Meanwhile, Grace and Marcus left the building and got into Grace's personal car that Daniel had never even known existed, and they drove through the busy streets of Lagos feeling lighter than they had felt in months. Grace had finally closed this chapter of her life completely, and she could move forward without any unfinished business or lingering questions about what might have been. Marcus told her he was proud of how she had handled everything with grace and dignity, and Grace laughed and said that was ironic considering her name was literally Grace. They drove to their new home in Ikoyi, a beautiful house that Grace had purchased after the wedding, and they sat on the balcony overlooking the city as the sun began to set over Lagos. Grace leaned against Marcus and felt genuinely content for the first time in years, and she realized that everything she had been through with Daniel had been necessary to lead her to this moment with a man who truly valued and respected her. Marcus kissed the top of her head and told her that this was just the beginning of their story together, and Grace smiled because she believed him with her whole heart. But their peaceful moment was interrupted by Grace's phone ringing, and when she looked at the screen her face went pale because the caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the location indicated it was from Abuja. She answered hesitantly, and the voice on the other end made her blood run cold with a message that would turn her entire world upside down once again. The caller claimed to be her father's former business partner, someone Grace had never heard of before, and he said he had information about her parents' death that would change everything she thought she knew about that accident. He told her that the motor accident that unalived her parents wasn't an accident at all, but rather a carefully planned murder, and he had evidence that would prove who was responsible and why they had wanted her parents dead. Grace felt her hands start to shake as she gripped the phone, and Marcus immediately noticed something was wrong and took her hand in his. The caller said he needed to meet with her in person to share the evidence because it was too dangerous to discuss over the phone, and people's lives, including Grace's own, might be in danger if the wrong people found out what he knew. Grace agreed to meet him the following week in Abuja, and after she hung up the phone, she sat there in stunned silence trying to process what she had just heard. Marcus asked her what was wrong, and Grace turned to him with tears streaming down her face and told him that everything she thought she knew about her parents' death might be a lie. She had spent the last 7 years believing it was a tragic accident that stole her parents away from her. But now someone was claiming it was murder, and that meant someone had deliberately taken them from her and had been walking around free all this time. Marcus held Grace as she cried, and he promised her that they would get to the bottom of this together and find out the truth no matter how painful it might be. Grace nodded against his chest, and she realized that just when she thought her life was finally settling into peace and happiness, a new storm was brewing on the horizon that could destroy everything she had built. She thought about Daniel and his problems, and realized that what he was going through was nothing compared to what she might be about to face, because the truth about her parents' death could unravel secrets that powerful people had spent years trying to keep buried. As the sun set completely over Lagos and darkness settled over the city, Grace made a decision that would set her on a path she never expected to walk. She would go to Abuja and meet this mysterious caller, and she would find out the truth about what really happened to her parents no matter what it cost her. Marcus would be by her side every step of the way, and together they would face whatever came next with the same courage and strength that had brought them this far. But neither of them knew that the journey they were about to embark on would test their love and their marriage in ways they couldn't imagine. And the enemies they would make along the way would stop at nothing to keep the truth from coming to light. Who really unalived Grace's parents all those years ago? And why would someone wait 7 years to come forward with evidence about a murder that everyone thought was just a tragic accident? The answers were waiting in Abuja, and Grace was about to discover that her story was far from over and the biggest battles of her life were still ahead of her.